Boyd and I are in Calgary for our first NA history presentation in Canada, and I'm in the home of a man named Joel who is out of town and gracious enough to allow me to stay in his small little condo here where I'm recording this presentation. In coming to Canada to do an NA history presentation, it provided an opportunity to dig into some of the history of Narcotics Anonymous in Canada and wanted to do a short overview of the first uh, evidence of NA in Canada that we discovered, which was an early New York NA version that occurred in Montreal. And so early New York NA, as a reminder, was started by Danny C., who had been introduced to 12-step recovery at the narcotic farm in Lexington through the Addicts Anonymous group. 1949, he gets out after his eighth admission, returns to New York City, and starts what we refer to as the early New York NA, which does not exist anymore. So much of this information comes from a small number of letters exchanged between Lynn and Bill W. of Alcoholics Anonymous. And those letters occurred between January and May of 1957. There's a timeline that can be put together based on Lynn's writing. So in March of 51, she came off narcotic drugs via spiritual experience in jail in Windsor, Ontario, though after this she begins to drink more heavily. In October of 53, she, quote, came in touch with the Alcoholics Anonymous program, and she refers to, in her letter from 57, having almost 4 years of being free of alcohol. And this speaks to kind of a unique part of her experience of recognizing that the issue for her was the condition of addiction and not the specific substance. So she stopped using narcotics, realized the same obsession and compulsion existed with alcohol. She gets off alcohol. Then in 1954, she reaches out to Danny C., stating that she was the only, quote, ex-addict in her AA group and had to stay dry, quote, or go back on the stuff. And so this is worth noting that, Danny was a straight addict who didn't really have a foundation in AA. He didn't have other AA members who had the dual problem of addiction to other drugs. And he was going at it alone at a time with really hostile efforts from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, making it very hard to hold meetings. He doesn't adopt the traditions, and one of the things that happens as a result is he is much more open with the press about his personal experience and stories. So he's not adhering to an 11th tradition form of anonymity. And then this, as a result, means that the word is spreading that there is something similar to AA for addicts. And so this is how Lynn learns about it, because Danny is speaking, to the press. She says that she saw him on television. Interestingly, Bill W. indicated that he had seen Danny on television, but had never met him in person. But this is how she learns about this and why she reaches out. Also of interest is in March of 54, she says that she also stopped using barbiturates, stating until that time, quote, I had no idea were in any way detriment to me. So this was not uncommon in Alcoholics Anonymous during this period where people were underaware or unaware of the problems of barbiturates and sedatives and uh, other narcotics and so forth. And so you can see this evolution of her really kind of coming to understand that freedom for her was going to be based on total abstinence. In November of 54, she moves to Montreal and is attending AA meetings, and she meets two other ex-addicts at the AA meetings, though she says one is still hooked. She had some literature that Danny C. had sent her, but had no intention of starting an NA meeting. Imagine that this was probably the Our Way of Life pamphlet that Danny adapted from Lexington, Kentucky, with the Addicts Anonymous group's Our Way of Life pamphlet. Uh, she did write that, quote, one of these ex-addicts who's a psychiatrist telephoned me that perhaps we had enough for a nucleus for an NA group. So probably this idea of, kind of finding your tribe, she shows up, she introduces the idea of NA. One of the ex-addicts says, let's start a group. And on December 23rd, 1954, the first NA meeting in Montreal is held in the psychiatrist's apartment. There's two people in attendance. Lynn was unable to attend, but did call into the meeting. In February of 55, they get their own meeting space, which is a classroom at Loyola College where an AA group had been meeting for 14 years. In the spring of 55, interestingly, these other two addicts go back to AA and kind of give up this trial of the NA group. Despite that, and despite being on her own, Lynn continues to hold the meeting in case anyone shows up. A lot of people starting recovery meetings, kind of, you hear this history of just keeping the door open as a very kind of unique, dedicated form of service. And it seems to pay off because by the end of the year, gradual growth had resulted in a bilingual group. In May of 56, Lynn opens a central office because the telephone calls and business became too much for her bedroom, which was in a private house. In September of 56, an NA meeting opens in Toronto. So this is where kind of the meat and potatoes of their correspondence is really interesting. And so, some context is that Lynn again is fairly isolated and is looking for support. She had corresponded a lot with Danny C., but when he developed cancer, he became slow in his responses. And then she learned in October of 56 that he had passed in August of 56. She'd also consulted with Dave B. Dave B. started the first AA meeting in Quebec. He got sober in 1944, and he was a Class B trustee in the early 60s. She felt like he thought that she was just kind of reinventing the wheel in some ways and wasn't getting the support really that she needed. So she's turning to Bill and she's asking Bill. Another piece of context here is that financially things are difficult. She's, having trouble paying her grocery bills. And so that's kind of the context for some of this. And she makes an argument to Bill in her first letter that alcoholism is simply another form of addiction and suggests that NA and AA should be unified under a single title like Addicts Anonymous because, quote, an alcohol addict is still an addict. Quote, put it under one title. You would still have the groups for the different types of addicts if it were necessary. Call it Addicts Anonymous. You could take full credit for the discovery of it. So I don't know. I guess the way I kind of read this is she's proposing an umbrella Addicts Anonymous, and then you may have different groups, like they may be listed today, like an LGBT meeting or a women's meeting or a literature meeting. So maybe she's proposing an Addicts Anonymous umbrella, and you might have a meeting that is focused on alcoholics, and you may have a meeting focused on narcotics. But she's reaching out with this idea, and you can look back at her experience of giving up narcotics, and if a little bit later giving up alcohol, and then a little bit later giving up barbiturates. That addiction is really kind of the core issue, not the substance for her. Bill replies almost 2 months later. He suggests that she get in touch with Betty T. Betty T had been to the narcotic farm, had been introduced to Addicts Anonymous, gone back to Los Angeles in 51, joined Alcoholics Anonymous there, and she watched dual problem members, persons with addiction to alcohol and drugs other than alcohol, as well as what would be referred to as the straight addict, who had no alcohol history. She saw AA members who were not aware of the dangers of sedatives and other narcotics. And so she starts this habit forming drug group of AA to kind of address those needs. Um, and so Bill says, get in touch with Betty T. And Lynn had also indicated that she had hoped to one day write a book for NA. And Bill writes, quote, I too have dreamed of a book based on Alcoholics Anonymous, but altered for the needs to the addict with an addict story selection. Uh, she follows up 2 days later pretty quickly, and there's kind of two things that she's doing in her letter. She's asking Bill to identify as an addict, and she further articulates her belief that alcoholism and addiction are not separate conditions. But darn it, Bill, just try to see what I'm getting at. That you are only addicted to alcohol, so it is hard for you to see yourself as an addict. If someone has called you an alcoholic or addict 30 years ago, it wouldn't have meant one damn to you, but it would have meant a very great deal to those who associate themselves with the word addict. And so if we pause here, I think this speaks to one of the things that Jimmy Kay wrote about regarding the tired old lie that once an addict, always an addict would no longer be tolerated by society or the addict themselves. It speaks to, one, the lack of belief that individuals addicted to drugs other than alcohol could recover, and two, that there were just that many more barriers and obstacles faced by individuals addicted to drugs other than alcohol than alcoholics. She goes on to say, I would not want to see anything happen to a bunch of alcoholics who insisted on being called alcoholics to recover. So if calling yourself an addict is going to get in the way of your recovery, don't bother. But if they did identify as addicts, she says, this is all that would really be required to throw the doors wide open for these hundreds of so-called junkers and habitual addicts. Honest to God, Bill. So she's really making this plea, that more people could be helped if he identifies as an addict, and it would open up the door for other people to identify. She also says, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that alcoholism is addiction to alcohol. It is addiction that is the problem, not the chemical or the drug that the person is addicted to. So we've seen this shift between AA powerless over alcohol and what she does, and then also what today's NA does, which kind of focuses the source of the problem on the condition, not on the substance. She updates on her plans for a book. She's going to call it Recovery from Addiction, that will take in all addictions. She seeks Bill's permission to use parts of his story and also indicates that she'll be including Danny C's history. Now, interestingly, in 55, there's some notes of her taking the big book, the chapter How It Works, and making some modifications. So this is prepared by the Montreal group of Narcotics Anonymous. And then you can see this evolution. One, we admitted we were crossed out as powerless over drugs, and in handwriting above is addicts. And so you see this evolution from placing the source of location of the problem on the substance to on the individual. In May, a couple months later, Bill replies again. He agrees in principle that alcoholism and addiction are the same. It is the same problem, and I make no doubt that the practice of the same principles and truths will help a vast area of it. However, he thinks it's not practical to merge the two programs. He cites his observations with Betty T to support this assertion. Quote, at no time has she been able to make addicts into AA members and to have them received as they should be. His belief for why this has been unable to happen is reflected in the letter. He says, the failure has to do with an almost inexplainable distrust and dislike of alcoholics and addicts for each other. He makes these references in a number of letters. In this letter in particular, he says, one day years ago, I met a man in the corridor of Town's hospital where I used to go as a patient. I was there on a 12-step job. I asked him for a match to light my cigarette. Hauntingly, he drew himself up and said, get away from me, you goddamn alcoholic. This is only one case, but I know this is that antipathy. So he's describing his interaction with somebody who was addicted to drugs other than alcohol. It is only the alcoholic who has had the narcotic problem also that can seem to bridge the gap. So the straight addict and the straight alcoholic cannot kind of bridge that difference. The person with the dual problem, Bill's proposing, can be that bridge member, can bridge the gap. There is where people like Betty T come in. They can be AA members and members of a narcotic organization also, very successfully. It is on this bridge that I think we will have to place our hopes. And what he says in other letters is he's really interested in seeing a separate organization to deal with the narcotic problem. What's interesting about this is this exchange is a few months, 5 or 6 months before he ends up in a flurry of correspondence with Betty T and Larry T regarding addicts in AA, where he ultimately has to decide through the problems other than alcohol essay in the February '58 Grapevine that non-alcoholics cannot become AA members, and kind of drew that boundary. Uh, One other thing came across in some General Service Committee minutes is that permission was denied Narcotics Anonymous in Montreal to reprint chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, with the suggestion that new material be created for this purpose. However, and this is really interesting, this is the first time we've seen this, permission in writing. Permission was granted for the use of their adaptation of the 12 steps, providing the following credit is given. Adapted from the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous with permission of AA Publishing Incorporated. And this is one of the things that Boyd frequently talks about, is when making this decision to say that AA is for alcoholics only. Bill didn't stop and say that also means that we are not sharing our methods. What Bill did do was say, yes, people can adapt our steps and traditions for their own groups. They just need to give permission for that. Concluding thoughts on this. One is that in the absence of a formal service structure with a public relations or public informations function, both for today's NA at this time in the '50s or the early New York NA, really the only way that word of a solution like AA that could help addicts was being spread through Danny C's frequent press coverage. That was the main way people were learning about this in the '50s. What became of Lynn or this version of NA in Montreal is unknown. Lynn had a foundation in AA that Danny didn't have. However, she did not appear to have the same amount of support from other bridge members as Jimmy had when he was part of starting today's NA. And I think this is just another opportunity to view this unique time in AA history and how Bill was navigating it, and another reminder that service structures help connect and support groups.